Good evening, everyone. I, Bianca Chetyar, Lead Ambassador, welcome you all to the closing ceremony of the Public Concern for Governance Trust is a registered trust founded in 2002 by Mr. Julio Ribeiro, Dr. R.K. Anand, and late Mr. B.G. Deshmukh to increase public participation and activism towards creating a more transparent and efficient government system. We at PCGT strive to promote good governance, sadbhava among citizens, and ethical values amongst the youth. PCGT successfully organized the first edition of the conclave in 2021 on the theme Unity in Diversity and hosted eminent speakers such as Mr. Jawahar Sirkar, Mr. Asfi Chinoy, and Mr. Satish Sahani. The theme for PCGT conclave this year is Global Peace and Security, which is also the foundational principle of the UN Charter. With recent instances of aggression and terror across the globe, it is important to restore faith in people in the said principle and save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war and aggression. The conclave is being organized by PCGT's lead ambassadors, and we hosted attendees from various age groups through a variety of events like the Model United Nations, the open mic, as well as a few dialogues involving eminent speakers and experts on various aspects of global peace and security, ranging from lessons from the past to its relevance in the current times. To give us more insights about the conclave and what transpired during the 2 days, I now invite Ms. Dimple Jangir, lead ambassador, to please share the same with you. Over to you, Dimple.
Thank you, Bianca. Greetings. I am Dimple Jangir, the lead ambassador at Public Concern for Governance Trust, and I would be summarizing the 2-day conclave for all those present here at the closing ceremony. We started the conference with opening remarks by the PCGT chairman, Mr. VP Raja sir. Then we had a discussion on cybersecurity by our keynote speaker being Mr. Nandakumar Sarvade sir, who enlightened us about cybersecurity and gave us a deep insight on government policies involving cyber threats, cybersecurity, e-governance, etc. He also gave us an insight as to how should teenagers and young adults like us have an approach while handling technology. His inputs were quite practical and pragmatic. Another event we hosted the same day in the evening was our very first open mic, which was conducted offline in Thane at Bombay Portico, where youngsters full of energy expressed themselves through their writings, poems, songs, and stand-up comedy. We wanted this event to not be a competition, but a way to support each other's talent. It was an event for people with different interests and talents coming together with lovely performances. We had more than 40 people attending the event, with 12 of them being the performers. Therefore, we can proudly say that this was a hybrid conclave with offline and online events. We also organized our maiden edition of Model United Nations Conference, which spanned over 2 days with 4 sessions, which happened yesterday and today, involving students who discussed freedom of speech and expression with special emphasis on custodial violence. The committee being United Nations Human Rights Council, where students deliberated and debated on the given agenda. We had 30 delegates registered with us, taking part in the discussion of such an important topic. We had also planned a talk with Mrs. Nirupama Menon Rao ma'am on Indo-China relations, but was cancelled due to certain health issues faced by ma'am. Last but not the least, we have our chief guest, Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya sir, addressing us on Russia-Ukraine crisis at the closing ceremony right now, and we can't wait to hear him. In short, we had very fruitful and perceptive 2 days of conclave on global peace and security. Although I have summarized the conclave as the way it has transpired over the last 2 days, but our journey started 9 months ago under the guidance of our chairman, trustees, and coordinator, Advocate Shivam Jain Kakaria sir. Now, I would like to request Bianca to take over.
Thank you, Dimple. As we're in association with Praveen Gandhi College of Law, Mumbai, which is a premier law college providing high-quality legal education. The head of this institute, Dr. Navashikha Dwara, has always lent us a helping hand and reached out whenever required. Dr. Navashikha Dwara has a plethora of qualifications, including BA from Guwahati University, MA and PhD from Mumbai University, and also holds a diploma in the Russian language. She is a perfectionist who is very particular about her work, but is also a friend when you need her. Apart from her qualifications, she has been an inspiration and guiding force for everyone at Praveen Gandhi College of Law. Dr. Dwara has presented papers at national and international conferences. She has also been an alumni of the US State Department and visited the United States as a delegate. I now request Dr. Navashikha Dwara, Principal of Praveen Gandhi College of Law, Mumbai, to address us. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction. In the beginning, I would like to thank PCGT for giving us the opportunity to be part of this endeavor in sensitizing the students, sensitizing the youth, imparting ethical values, all driving towards good governance. I also thank all the participants and resource person for making this a feasibility. Without their participation, this event would not have been successful. Looking forward for continuous collaboration with the PCGT. Before I conclude, I just wanted to make certain observation on this my certain ideas, my views on the question of global peace and security, which I want to share with the esteemed gathering. When you talk about global peace and security, we are talking about peace and security in the world among states which are independent and equal sovereigns. And that is what creates the difficulty in creating a rule-based international order, which we have seen with in the contemporary days with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do you go about creating global peace and security? Can there be a permanent solution to the threat to global peace and security coming from different quarters, be it cyber terrorism or any other issues? The international community has been constantly striving in creating a kind of a rule-based regime, be in the field of climate change, be in the field of terrorism. However, we can never compare this to the domestic rule-based legal or rule-based order. I'm sure the deliberation must have given like a kind of a good insight into the whole issue of public global peace and security. Unfortunately, I could not be part of this whole issue. Most of the discussions, I could not be part of it, but I'm sure constructive discussion must have taken place, giving us a way ahead. With this, I conclude, and over to you, Bianca. And thank you once again to all the esteemed gatherings, and thank you to PCGT for giving us the opportunity to be part of this whole endeavor. Over to you, Bianca. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind words. PCGT Conclave would not have been possible without our pillar of strength, Mr. Julio Ribeiro. Mr. Julio Ribeiro graduated in Commerce and Law from Mumbai University. He joined the Indian Police Service in 1953 and rose to be the Commissioner of Police Mumbai from February 1982 to May 1985. Later, Sir served in quick succession as Director General, Central Reserve Police Force, Director General of Police Gujarat, Special Secretary to the Government of India's Home Ministry, Director General of Police Punjab, and finally an advisor to the Governor of Punjab. Besides other awards, he is the recipient of the Padma Bhushan in 1987. Post-retirement, Sir was appointed as ambassador to Romania, where he served for 4 years, from 1989 to 1993. The then Prime Minister, Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, had asked him to be the governor of Jammu and Kashmir, but he declined because of his involvement in social work in his native city of Mumbai. I now request Mr. Julio Ribeiro, founding trustee of PCGT, to address us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bianca. You are like our Mr. Mukhopadhaya will be little confused about so many ambassadors over here. Yes, including Bianca and Dimple and Shlok and Tanmay and who else? I mean,
Brushali.
Pardon?
Brushali.
Brushali, of course, such a
not to forget yourself,
important ambassador in our list. So I must tell Miss Ambassador Mukhopadhaya that this is a term which we have been using for a long time to encourage our students. We have a campus ambassador in every college in Mumbai, which is affiliated to us, with whom we work. And we also have lead campus ambassadors. These are the lead campus ambassadors who have shone, who have made a mark among the campus ambassadors, and we see more. They are going to really shine in future and be our leaders. So these are our leadership projects, which Mr. Shivam Jain Kakadiya organizes so beautifully and so well. And I'm very happy to have these young people and to be associated with these ambassadors also, as I'm happy to be associated with Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. Now, he was one of the most outstanding of our Indian Foreign Service officers, and he has made a mark. He was ambassador in Afghanistan, he was ambassador in Burma, he was all these countries around which are important for us, and we have heard him earlier, and we were very impressed. We were very happy that he had enlightened us, and we would like him to enlighten us again on this very important subject that he is going to talk about. None of us had ever thought that after these weapons of mass destruction, like the nuclear weapons that many countries have, 4 or 5 of them, including India, that there would be war again in this world. But it is an unwanted war has been thrust upon us, and we notice the destruction that is being caused, and how people are uprooted and so badly dispersed. It's very sad to see what we see on the big screen. But we have to also understand what is the reasons and what are the consequences of this war. Where is it going to lead? We have had some kind of premonition because of the rise in the petrol prices, rise in the diesel prices, rise in some rise we have seen in the prices of essential commodities. This is going to be a fallout. There's no doubt about it. But besides that, we have to consider the long-term consequences of this war, which Ambassador Mukhopadhaya will definitely talk to us about. I am very happy to have him with us again, and I am happy that he thinks that we are important enough. I mean, making young people aware of what is happening, understanding the problems, trying to be part of the world's headaches, and learning not only knowledge, not only getting knowledge, but also analyzing these problems and making their own decision, taking their own stands on these problems. It is very important for our young people, if they want to be leaders, to think every day about what they see is happening in our own country and also in the world, both. So PCGT's leadership program, this particular one is an annual group. This conclave is an annual event. And as I said last year, we discussed, Bianca mentioned that we had a discussion on just switch it off. I mean, keep it on silent. And this year it will be on global peace and security. That is what we are discussing. And we are very happy to have, as I said, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. And I now give the mic back to Bianca. Bianca, you take over, please, and continue.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for addressing all of us. And now we have come to the part of the ceremony for which all of you have been eagerly waiting. That is the address by our chief guest, Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya, former Indian ambassador to Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya's diplomatic career has been notable for the range of his professional experience, covering media, culture, human rights, development, defense, and security issues. He graduated from Delhi University with a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in sociology. Mr. Mukhopadhaya has an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service, during which he served in various capacities in Indian embassies and missions in Mexico, Cuba, France, and the United Nations, the Ministry of Defense of India from 2002 to 2005, and eventually as India's ambassador to Syria from 2006 to 2008, to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013, and finally to Myanmar from 2013 to 2016. He also opened the Indian Embassy in Kabul in November 2001 after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan in November 2001. Mr. Mukhopadhaya has also worked at the UN headquarters in New York as a consultant on social development and as a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. He also handled the Festival of India in France in 1985. His other affiliations include an association with the Niti Aayog's Niti Forum for the Northeast as an advisor and chair of a CII task force on economic ties with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. His extracurricular interests include Indian and world music and travel, with a special interest in the northeast of India and Southeast Asia. Sir, it is indeed our privilege and honor to have you deliver the keynote address on the topic, Russia-Ukraine crisis and the changing global order. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bianca, for that very kind introduction. Let me add that I'm also currently affiliated as a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. You know, my president would be very disappointed if that was not mentioned. So I feel the need to mention it. Dr. Julio Ribeiro, Dr. Nafshika Dwara, Mr. VP Raja, other trustees of the Public Concern for Governance Trust, Shivam Jain Kakadia, PCGT Conclave convener, Dimple, Bianca, you yourself, members of the PCGT and all those present here today, physically or virtually. Let me assure Mr. Ribeiro that nothing gives me greater pleasure than to meet and talk to young minds. And in fact, 2 days from now, I'll be addressing another event at a college in Delhi, physically this time, on their annual event. And that will relate more to, the unrealized potential of India, in particular the youth and farmers. And this is based on some work that I've been doing more lately in Manipur. But let me begin by roundly congratulating the PCGT for holding this conclave amidst all the turmoil that surrounds us internally in our region and in the world, with lectures by distinguished speakers, amongst them my highly respected senior and former Foreign Secretary, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, which I'm disappointed to learn today that she was not able to join. Allow me also to thank the Trust for inviting me to speak on this occasion. I must confess, my first instinct was to shy away. One can't avoid geopolitics, but as a rule, I speak only on countries where I have served and on perspectives that those countries and India share on the world. And I have not served either in Russia or Ukraine. Moreover, I've been a bit out of touch with the news over the last 3 weeks, kickstarting a personal community sort of project in Manipur. At a time, this is coming at a time when the world is buffeted not only by a global pandemic for the last 2 years, but also right-wing extremism and domestic polarization in India, a Taliban military takeover still sustained by force in Afghanistan, economic mismanagement and food and fuel disturbances, civil riots and disturbances in Sri Lanka, from Sri Lanka to Pakistan and beyond the region to others as far as Peru, a virtual civil war in Myanmar being suppressed by the brutal military force following the Myanmar military coup of February 2021, political upheaval in Pakistan that I'm sure you've all read of today, and a full-blown war in Ukraine. In reality, Ambassador Rao and many other more illustrious colleagues would have been able to far better address these issues. But such is the authority of the legendary Mr. Ribeiro that in spite of these handicaps, I could not decline. So here I am rationalizing to myself that a deployment at the Ministry of External Affairs as a Deputy Secretary on the Soviet Union and the Eastern European desk in the 1980s during the Gorbachev years is enough for me to speak on the issues at hand. I hope I have something to add to your knowledge. I have been asked to speak on the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the changing global order. To be frank, we are still too close to the event to accurately discern its impact. Major conflicts like this take years to unfold, and each fold has its own ripple effects, which impinge on others dynamically. Indeed, the antecedents of this conflict go back to the end of the Cold War, and before that to the Second War itself, and even before that to the Russian Revolution. But the roots of the Russia-Ukraine war go back much deeper in history into Imperial Russia, and the issues of ethnicity, religion, identity, and belonging. And even as the war has been spurred, by present-day geopolitics, they fan these deeper issues in profound ways that both revive and renew their value and impact on the future. I do not have the knowledge, nor do we have the time to touch on these deeper issues here. But a few things are clear. Whatever the outcome, the Russia-Ukraine war is a momentous development, ranking with the end of the Cold War in a defeat of the Soviet Union and the rise of China in post-Second World War history in importance. Its impact may or may not be as significant, depending on the course of the war. It could change the world that we know for a long time. But before I step into that, the here and now of the war and its future impact, it may be instructive to look back a little into the past, to look at some of the more recent events and forces that have led to the current situation. Putin's actions in Ukraine are inexcusable, but every action, even that of Hitler in the last century, has a certain history behind it, to which many others contributed. In the case of Putin, his actions have their source at the treatment of Russia at the end of the Cold War. In a highly perceptive article in the influential US foreign policy journal Foreign Affairs in 1992, soon after the end of the Cold War, the former US National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, reflected on some of the issues that concern us today. Reflecting on what victory in the Cold War may have looked like to anyone during that period, he said that the disintegration of the Soviet Union and democratization of the Warsaw Pact countries far exceeded the imagination of anyone who had thought of it. Turning to the Treaty of Versailles, the rise of Hitler, the fall of the Weimar Republic, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the integration of post-war Germany into Europe and the Western economic and political order, he argued that how one deals with a fallen, defeated power is just about as important as the victory itself. Although his idea of inclusion probably fell short of what would have been required to prevent the situation today, he argued that efforts must be made to integrate Russia into Europe economically and politically. This is not what happened. One of the unwritten and much debated understandings behind the then Soviet President Gorbachev's acceptance of the reunification of Germany under popular pressure from East Germany, stemming from Mr. Gorbachev's efforts at perestroika and glasnost, which mean restructuring and openness, which Mr. Ribeiro, you must be very familiar with, having served in Romania. was that NATO would not be extended eastwards towards Russia. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many even questioned the justification for the continuation of NATO. In actual fact, what happened was exactly to the contrary. Step by step, and reflecting popular aspirations, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, first Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, then bit by bit, the rest of Eastern Europe sought to join the European Union and NATO, progressively extending it close to Russia's borders. Russia warned against this eastern expansion of NATO several times, most dramatically over Georgia and Ukraine. The pressure for this eastward expansion came most vocally from Eastern Europe, that had felt the heavy weight of Russia the most. Countries like Germany and France that had an intuition of where this was leading did try to take Russian sensitivities into account, soften the process, attempt to be much more inclusive, such as the Minsk agreements on Ukraine brokered by France. President Putin at one stage even proposed Russian association with the NATO. This was brusquely turned down. US unipolarity in the aftermath of the Cold War and then the Gulf Wars, the color revolutions in Eastern Europe supported by the US, and what is called the Maidan protests in Kiev, in Ukraine in 2014 in particular, and the progressive eastward expansion of NATO, the West's refusal to exclude Ukraine from it as late as the Geneva summit in January 22 with Biden, convinced Putin that the Western objective was to corner and force Russia to its knees. Emboldened by successes in Georgia and Crimea and the rise of China and its rivalry with the US, which gave him some room for maneuver, Putin began to mark his red lines more and more bluntly. These warnings too were not heeded. Whether or not President Putin's fears were justified or not, one thing is clear. Contrary to the warnings of Brzezinski and many other giants of US security and diplomatic thought, like George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, and John Mearsheimer, Russia was never treated with respect post the Cold War. Following the end of it, and through the years of the Yeltsin presidency until now, Russia was treated as a has-been, worthy only of bilateral dealings relating to nuclear disarmament or arms and missile controls. Unlike China or even India, it was not treated as a global power on issues like the state of the global economy, climate change, trade negotiations, or anything that constituted the global agenda. Russia was just treated as another country. This was even evident in the descriptions of the post-Cold War era in terms of a unipolar or sometimes multipolar world, with emerging powers included in it. In actual fact, apart from a brief period, the post-Cold War era has never been either truly unipolar or multipolar. It has been tricentric, with an erratic US, especially under President Trump, a rising and assertive China, especially under President Xi Jinping, and a revanchist Russia under Putin, waiting in the wings to reassert itself. Other powers, however much we may like to think that we are major powers, played a largely secondary role with the support of one of the three. It was also a self-centric world. So I use tricentric in two ways, trilateral and self-centric, with each country asserting its self-centric interest expressed in the slogan, America first, or my country first, unlike during the Cold War, where both sides spoke in the name of a larger, greater global good, whether it was in terms of an open political and economic systems and individual freedoms, or the collective good of workers and the good of all, as it was in the case of the communist societies. As late as the Geneva summit, it could be argued that uneasy with the rise of China and Russia's increasing reliance on it, and a weakened US under President Biden, Putin was trying to negotiate a new template of relations between East and West that accepted Russia as a major geopolitical player and allowed Russia's security on its west and room for maneuver with China on the east. This does not appear to have been picked up. From the US perspective too, this appears short-sighted. Having rightly defined China as its principal strategic challenger, it does not make sense for the US to make an enemy out of Russia and confront two strategic adversaries at two ends of the Eurasian landmass. Rather, it made more sense to make up and compromise with the weaker one, Russia, to confront the larger threat. Just as in earlier decades, President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger made huge concessions to China in order to reorient it geopolitically away from the Soviet Union towards the US. There are others who have argued that, in fact, the US has gained diplomatically by responding to President Putin's challenge in massing troops against Ukraine by unifying Europe towards it. But this seems a post facto effect rather than a prior design. Turning to the here and now, the failure to take into account Russian sensitivities, security, and honor has already led to a hot war between Russia and Ukraine, supported materially, militarily, and economically by the West. It has initiated an economic war between the West and Russia and a virtual second Cold War in Europe. Western sanctions against Russia are perhaps the most severe by any grouping against any country so far, maybe barring North Korea. It is already having an impact on Russia, but sanctions have not always achieved what they were intended to in far smaller countries like North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar. And Russia has demonstrated historically the capacity to bear pain when they have a righteous cause. But is the Ukraine war a righteous cause for Russians? And are the Russian people willing to bear this pain for it? This is an open question. The war has for now also united Europe in confronting Russia, reinforced US-Europe ties that had been losing over the last decade, especially over the Trump presidency, given NATO a new lease of life, but also laid the seeds for rethinking Europe's security architecture within Europe. Depending on the actions of the parties involved, the war could easily transmute into a hot war involving the West and Russia in Europe, and perhaps even a wider world war. War has a dangerous logic. Often a reverse is the trigger for an escalation of the war. The idea of security itself is fluid. There is no clarity as to what constitutes secure borders. Each frontier begs another one to secure the earlier one. This is even more so for a country that has historically sought territory to secure itself. Empress Catherine the Great is famously said to have said, "Russia has no natural borders." This logic lives today as well in the plains of Central Europe. Blurred ethnic and cultural boundaries through history complicate matters further. There is an irony in a country that claims to be the fountainhead of Slavic pride, turning its anger on another. There is a case that President Putin could have ended the confrontation with the integration of Luhansk and Donetsk into Russia and negotiated Ukraine neutrality from a position of strength, instead of proceeding with his offensive from the north towards the capital, Kiev. Was it a move of a cool chess player, or did President Putin overplay his hand? Would the West have accepted neutrality after denying it all along, after these acts of aggression? That would have amounted to appeasement. Would they have gone along with his occupation of the two republics, just as they reconciled themselves with his actions in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014? And if he had, would Putin have been satisfied with that and not raised his demands further? He has made it clear that Ukrainian neutrality is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the ceasefire. He also wants incorporation of the two ethnically Russian-dominated republics of Ukraine and Crimea into Russia, which are questionable international law, and a denazification of Ukraine that is tantamount to political tutelage and interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. Would President Putin not want more if any of these were accepted? Since then, President Putin has flaunted the possible use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent to the West or otherwise, although that is not so clear. Do these actions suggest overreaction and panic? We should be grateful that despite reports of atrocities in the Ukraine war, both sides have practiced some restraint in the use of force on the one hand by Russia and direct military intervention on the part of the US or the West that could trigger such a scenario on the other. So far, this has been a war fought by Ukrainians and Russians. Though there are reports of ideological mercenaries willing to join the former, and the Russian use of the Chechen loyalist leader Ramon Kadyrov in the war against Ukraine. The Ukrainians have offered stiff resistance, forcing the Russians to move back from Kiev and Sumy in the north, amidst reports of serious atrocities in Bucha and other places, and severe artillery shelling in many cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, and several others. To concentrate on the south and east, trying to secure and integrate Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea into Russia, and denying Ukraine access to the Black Sea. But will this be a prolonged war, like the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, that ultimately played a huge part in the downfall and breakup of the Soviet empire, in quotes? Is the US using Ukraine to permanently weaken and perhaps even balkanize Russia, just as it did the Soviet Union in the past, so that it is no longer a threat to the West? Putin has tried to justify his actions with recourse to a personal take on history, where Russian humiliation in the hands of the West, Eastern Europe, and Ukraine are writ large, but that can hardly justify his aggression against Ukraine. The war also promises to eclipse the single biggest geopolitical fault line in the post-war era, eclipsing the incipient polarization of powers between the US on one side and China on the other, reflected in groupings like the AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US military pact, ostensibly predicated on China, and the Quad, involving the US, Japan, Australia, and India, in a political and technological grouping aimed at responding to the Chinese challenge in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific at large, to which China has also been responding in various ways. But on Ukraine, China has played a restrained role so far, blaming the US for the crisis, but keeping out of it, not materially or even diplomatically helping Russia as yet, and counseling dialogue. It has supported Russia's right to protect its, in quotes, legitimate security interests, but like India, abstained on most UN, General Assembly, and Security Council votes on the issue, and has also counseled diplomacy. It could emerge as the single biggest beneficiary of the conflict diplomatically. Its impact within Russia also needs to be considered. Given the media propaganda war and demonization of President Putin by the West, and the complete suppression of the media and freedom of expression in Russia, it is difficult to ascertain popular Russian support for the war. For the present, there is a case that sanctions are biting, but not sufficient signs of internal political or economic upheaval. Comparisons with Hitler in the Western and Ukrainian media are misleading. President Putin's actions are grounded in Russian humiliation on the part of the West, national pride, national security, and the security of Russians in what we can call the Russosphere. But Putin is not a meteor that has suddenly emerged from nowhere, capitalizing on the demonization of the other within Russia to mobilize the masses, as we saw with Nazi Germany and Hitler. That may also limit his ability to rally the Russian people as Hitler did in Nazi Germany. Putin's aggression is not grounded in racial superiority, but the lack of respect by the West. His target is the West and his political opponents perceived to be close to the West. He has plotted Russia's return to the world stage patiently over the years. He has likely made his moves calculatedly, perceiving a weakness on the part of the US under President Biden, especially following his withdrawal from Afghanistan. Although many have questioned India's repeated abstentions with explanations of its vote in the UN General Assembly and Security Council, of which it is a member until the end of this year, it is difficult to see what other position India could have adopted. India is too dependent on advanced Russian military technologies, weapon systems, platforms, and spares to do otherwise in the middle of a military face-off in Ladakh with China. Despite India's perceived pro-US tilt in recent decades, there is a strong current in favor of an independent foreign policy that does not follow the priorities set by the US, and strategic gratitude towards the former Soviet Union and its successor state Russia for its steady support for India in the UN Security Council over the liberation of Bangladesh. That still counts in Indian public opinion and politics. Russia too has reached out to offer concessions on oil and gas supplies and rupee-ruble payment arrangements to bypass US sanctions against Russia that have provided some material to preserve the past sentimental support. But As Russian dependence on China limits its diplomatic support to India on India-China issues, and its ability to supply technology, and the war limits its ability to supply technologies, arms and spares, including possibly the S-400 missile defense systems that are the bone of contention between India and the US, papered over for now. This is a priori a political support. This a priori political support could come under strain. On the other side, India has concerns that the US focus on Russia and Europe could undermine its commitment to the Indo-Pacific and the India-China border to curb Chinese adventurism. Finally, there are the more globally systemic implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. Although most of the world is united in its disapproval, if not outright condemnation of the Russian action, it has already divided the world in three ways: between those that are with the US and Europe, a limited few loyal to Russia, and a large body reflected in the 58 countries who abstained from the vote on the expulsion of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, who prefer to keep out of the conflict. Even US allies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, that has its own issues with Russia, have taken positions on Russia that are at a tangent or odds with the US. Second, the scale of the economic sanctions against Russia and its significance in of its commodity trade with the rest of the world is also threatening to divide the world economically, with consequences that we can only faintly imagine now. Ukraine is a major supplier of food products, Russia of phosphates and fertilizers and fuel. Food and fuel shortages are already triggering anxiety and civil disturbance in many parts of the world, including South Asia and Latin America. As sanctions bite, it is prudent to prepare ourselves for worse days, just as we had to do with the COVID pandemic. And finally, we have to consider the implications of the war for democracy. Even prior to the war, the world was moving towards a less democratic world. According to One Democracy Watch NGO, VDEM, in 2021, the world experienced the lowest levels of democracy in the last 30 years. There were fewer countries democratizing since 1978, only 15, covering just 3% of the world's population. In our own neighborhood, Myanmar and Afghanistan have suffered severe jolts to democracy in favor of a violent military and a violent hardline theocracy sustained purely by force, respectively. Democracies too are turning increasingly majoritarian, using polarization, misinformation, fake news, and the complicit media as a political strategy. Too often, people confuse democracy with the Western political system. It is, in fact, a shorthand for basic human rights and freedoms, civil, political, and cultural rights, representative government, and public accountability. Things that I presume the PCGT stands for. It is not a luxury to be conferred by rulers. It is not clear that a Ukrainian or Western victory will deliver these rights. The same champions of democracy and human rights have sacrificed these same principles to autocrats, military rulers, and theocrats in Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Afghanistan at the expense of women, minorities, and ordinary civilians. There is a clear double standard in their approach to democracy in the West, reflected in Ukraine, and in the Northwestern world, where in different degrees it is tolerated in the name of cultural relativism or more cynical ends. There is also a profound problem with the West masquerading as champions of democracy and human rights when there are countless examples of their complicity and use of it for imperial purposes. In the end, democracy has to be fought for one's own good. But there is no doubt that a Russian victory in Ukraine will mean one more reverse for democracy, for human rights, and for the human cause. One has to hope for the Ukrainians, ourselves, and the world at large that Ukraine prevails, but that defeated powers too are given their respect and regard. And I just end with, I think, a comment that Dr. Dwara raised in the beginning about a rule-based international order. One of the things that we have seen through this entire process is the inefficacy and the toothlessness of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations already failed its mission during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic. But the roots of the problem don't really lie so much in the UN, which is after all a grouping of its member states that try to reach decisions by consensus. The root of the problem really lies in the polarization of the world today between what we could call broadly autocrats and democrats, but democrats with a pinch of salt, because democracy too is serving political ends in many cases. And every victory for every reverse for democracy is a victory for autocracy. So I end with those words that I do hope that democracy is not confused as a Western political system that is being imposed by others, but that it is a system of values that countries and people can define for themselves, respecting basic individual and collective rights and fundamental freedoms for themselves and for their compatriots. And only in such an inclusive world is it possible to have a much more functioning and better functioning United Nations and a more effective international rule-based order. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for shedding light on the ongoing crisis in Russia and Ukraine, on the history of NATO, history of sanctions, the Russian Revolution, and mostly on the early European and Russian history and how it is affecting the dynamics today. I'm sure that all of us definitely have learned, taken something from this crisis and the changing global order. The success of yet another edition of the conclave can be clearly attributed to the guidance of our chairman, Mr. V.P. Raja. Mr. V.P. Raja, after obtaining 2 postgraduate degrees in physics from Delhi University and Columbia University, respectively, he joined the Indian Administrative Services in 1974. As an IAS officer of the Maharashtra cadre, Sir has worked in various assignments at the district, state, and center. In recognition to his outstanding contributions to administrative reforms, while working as a collector of Satara and as Transport Commissioner Maharashtra, he was awarded the Distinguished Government Administration Award. With the Government of India, Sir worked at the Ministry of Human Resource Development, the Planning Commission, the Ministry of Defense, and at the Department of Atomic Energy. He retired as a principal advisor to the Department of Atomic Energy in September 2008. Thereafter, he was the chairman of the Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Commission for a period of 5 years. Concurrently, Sir was also the chairman of the Expert Appraisal Committee of the Ministry of Environment and Forests of the Government of India for appraising of new projects for coal mining and thermal power projects from the point of view of their environmental impacts. I now invite Mr. V.P. Raja to announce the winners of the Model United Nations Conference and give the concluding remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Bianca, for your kind words of introduction. As directed, I will announce the winners in the various sessions that we have had over the last 2 days on global peace and security and the various subjects. Let me first do it in the people who get verbal mentions. United Arab Emirates, Sarvesh Sriram. Are we going to project him or he's going to come on the screen? Shivam?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Oh, okay. So United Arab Emirates, Sarvesh Sriram. Then Brazil, Soham Lade. Qatar, Viraj Pangam. United Kingdom, Devashri Nene. Then honorable mentions, Honduras, Darshan Karya. Netherlands, Iram Sheikh. Then special mentions, United States of America, Tisha Sharma. Luxembourg, Sijil Sagarika. High Commendation, Republic of Korea, Tanay Musele. And the best delegate prize goes to India, Yash Bandari. So heartiest congratulations to everybody. They spent 4 sessions, altogether almost 6 hours, debating various issues. There were allotted nations and they represented those particular nations, and based on that performance, which was a committee was keeping scores, and based on that, these prizes have been awarded. So my heartiest congratulations, not only to the people who have got commendation and to the best delegate, but also to all the participants. Because as was mentioned, this is part of our leadership efforts to provide a platform for young college students to think about various things in the world. I'm really impressed to the heart to have heard Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya. I'm sure that he will convert this to a paper in his new capacity as in the Center for Policy Research. And I must confess that I eagerly read everything that comes from the Center for Policy Research. A lot of it comes from Mr. Shyam Saran. But now, in addition to Mr. Shyam Saran, we hope to see a lot of articles from Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya. Actually, after hearing him, and I heard him very attentively, I must confess, I must tell what exactly came to my mind. I was a college student and my subject was physics. I studied in St. Stephen's College, so I had a general interest in everything that was happening, though the subject of specialization was physics. But I do remember at that time, one of the books which I used to enjoy reading because of the English, the command, the beauty of expression, was The History of the Second World War by Winston Churchill. And I recall from memory the opening words in the book, which I'll try to paraphrase as I remember now. In the palmy days of Queen Victoria, nobody would have thought that the greatest perils are yet to come and the greatest triumphs are yet to be won. I think this is the opening sentence of the History of the Second World War by Winston Churchill. I was reminded of that because I was born after India's independence in the year 1948. And, we sailed through quite comfortably in the sense that, the world wars are over. Some wars did take place, Korea, Vietnam, but didn't bother us that much, except for the so-called, what we call the Chinese aggression in 1962. And then later the wars India had to fight with Pakistan in 65, and much later 71 with the liberation of Bangladesh. These are the wars which we saw from near quarters. Otherwise, by and large, life was peaceful. We very much believed in the Nehruvian model of growth. We were all for pro-development and respected Jawaharlal Nehru for the various initiatives he had taken, whether it was starting the 3-level technical education program, starting the IITs, various things. Then joined the civil service, and our career in the civil service, there were some ups and downs, but nothing too terrible. It was fairly peaceful. Our advice was heard. We could speak and give free and frank advice If you overruled, fine, but nobody stopped you from telling not only the minister, but chief ministers and prime ministers, sir, this is what I feel. And discussions were very open. So that is the kind of life. It was like the palmy days of Queen Victoria. Our life was quite palmy. And after retirement, particularly in the last 6-7 years, that's when a certain worry started with the kind of changes and narrative happening in India. The entire debate of the Gandhi-Nehru vision of India versus the RSS vision of India. And that was what was also, in a certain sense, a matter of concern for PCGT. Of course, we didn't believe in sermonizing. So we said the youngsters should be able to understand the pros and cons. And we in PCGT do believe that besides the pandemic, which became so important, we believe that and continue to believe that corruption and communalism are the two viruses which are very, very dangerous and destroying India. So it was these kinds of thoughts which made us in the last conclave to more or less have a theme, unity in diversity. Unity in diversity was the theme for last year's Lead Ambassadors Conclave. And I gave the background to that because we said we have to somehow bring back Gandhian ideals. The concept of unity in diversity, that India is a plural country with a very large number of ethnicity, religion, caste, languages. But within all that, there is an overall unity. And we need to celebrate that pluralism in society. Our conclave went off very well last year, the same things. And preparation for this conclave, as was mentioned by Bianca and Dimple Jangid, actually started almost 9 months ago. And the theme was global peace and security. So even 9 months ago, in terms of global peace, it was still palmy days. I mean, we didn't think that in such a short period, so many things will happen. So many things in terms of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, the US unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now more recently, the Russia using military force in Ukraine, the Chinese becoming very aggressive in the posturing vis-a-vis India, and within India itself, hate speech getting normalized. I mean, these are all, that's why I was reminded of Winston Churchill. We never thought that the greatest perils are yet to come. And these are the perils that we see today. Hate speech, where it is leading us in very nice places like Karnataka, getting disturbed by controversies like hijab and halal meat and what have you. It causes pain. It causes. Are we in the right direction? Are we moving in a right direction? But I get comfort from that second sentence of Winston Churchill. Perhaps the greatest triumphs are yet to be won. So I think we need to be optimistic as we are going through one of the biggest churnings globally as well as in India. Second is again, when we started with, as I said, the first almost half of my career was based on Nehruvian ideas. Then came the balance of payments crisis in 1990, and we adopted economic reforms, starting with Manmohan Singh and P.V. Narasimha Rao. And okay, we all pushed as civil servants the economic reforms and the market economy. It did increase our growth rate from the famous Hindu rate of growth of 3.5% to almost 8%, 8.5% during the best of times. And then we have this, what can be called as a sudden collapse. A collapse certainly accentuated by the pandemic, but really started after demonetization in 2016. And we are not recovered. All kind of things which could not have been visualized, that these are the things. So we are living in a changing society. Globalization was taken for granted. But now with all these recent events, we are back to Atmanirbhar, which is what Nehru believed in. But Nehru for a different reason. He had seen the impact of 450 years of Western dominance, the period of imperialism, expansionism, and colonization. So Nehru never wanted India to once again come into that stage. And that's why he believed in self-reliance. Of course, now the new word for self-reliance is Atmanirbhar. But now we want to be Atmanirbhar because we have seen the kind of things that happen. I've spent more time in the energy sector, and now we are all getting pushed, rightly so in a certain sense, that we need to move towards net zero carbon. And our Prime Minister has announced in Glasgow by 2070. The rest of the world wants to attain it by 2050. China wants to attain it by 2060. But the kind of policies which we are following for that, good, but question marks are there. With overemphasis on renewables, in the last 6 months, we have already had 2 extreme shortages of coal. Today, as I speak to you, there are states in India which have announced 2 days of load shedding for industries because there is no coal. And we thought that we never have to import coal, but now, we are importing at extraordinary, even NTPC is importing coal at very high prices just to keep electricity on. The point I'm making is we are living through interesting times. And well, we have a lot to learn, but nothing remains the same. Everything keeps changing. And the ability to analyze, the ability to unlearn, relearn, and the fact that we are not in a perfect world, and eternal vigilance is what is required. I agree with Mr. Mukhopadhaya that we don't have to see that democracy means the Western style of democracy. Democracy basically means respecting every human being. And but at my age, I'm still learning. I'm learning, and I'm amazed at this, the kind of changes that take place. If globalization was the catchword at the end of the last century, in the last 20 years, it is certainly the speed with which technology is moving. The speed with which technology is moving. And India is also pushing very hard in terms of digitizing everything. It has its pluses and minuses. There are people who will abuse this. Pegasus is a good example of that abuse. When the state itself can abuse it, the problems become even more serious. Now, these are all things which we need to reflect. And finally, the answer lies with every citizen realizing that citizenship is not merely exercising your vote once in 5 years, but paying attention to what happens within those 5-year periods, and speaking out. Or as one of our trustees, Dr. Anand, he is today in Panchgani in the Asia Plateau. But a thing which he often says is, when you see injustice, speak out. Don't remain silent. Speak out. Speak out, but don't be violent. So it is fighting for justice, more or less with the Gandhian concept of ahimsa. Don't be silent, but don't be violent is the word which Dr. Anand often uses, and it's a good thing to remember. I'd like to thank the lead ambassadors, the organizing committee, and everybody who has done a fantastic work. Everybody who worked on it also know all the kind of tribulations they went through over the last 9 months. But please remember, in all the ups and downs of decision making, also we learn. We learn team building. We learn the pluses and minuses, how to carry people along, or sometimes should we walk alone. The advice that Rabindranath Tagore gave to Mahatma Gandhi. Sometimes you need to walk alone. So that's what we mean by these activities. The leadership program only provides, the PCGT provides the platforms. The student, the lead ambassadors, campus ambassadors form their own organizing committee. We nudge them. We kind of, when they come for guidance, we try to provide some guidance, but everything is done by themselves. But please remember, in all these things, you learn. You learn team building. You learn where you need to take a stand, where you can kind of trade off or compromise, so to say, so that the entire team is taken along. And I observed all this, but I think it has been a great experience for everybody involved in this project. So thank you very much. Back to you, Bianca.
Thank you, sir, and heartiest congratulations to all the winners. Before we move on with the vote of thanks, it would be my utmost pleasure to host all of you at PCGT National Youth Parliament 2022, which will be conducted on the 30th and 31st of July by means of an online conference. Kindly register for the same by the link shared on the chat box. Secondly, apart from the National Youth Parliament, we're hosting a webinar tomorrow by Dr. Navashika Dwara on the topic, Rule-Based International Order on Russian Invasion of Ukraine. The registration link for the same is again shared on the chat box as well as on the WhatsApp groups. I now request Mr. Tanmay Patil, Lead Ambassador, to propose the vote of thanks. Over to you, Tanmay. Tanmay, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Bianca. So with, am I audible first of all?
Yes.
You're audible.
Yeah, thank you. So now I would like to go ahead with the vote of thanks. I'm Tanmay Patil and I'm a lead ambassador at PCGT. Good evening, everyone. I thank our chief guest, Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya, and his insights truly were really instrumental in understanding the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So the way how you explained the Russian history, the European history, the history of NATO, it really completed the whole circle. And we also understand that how connecting dots from history would lead to understanding the very statement that history repeats itself. And unless we make amends to it, it won't stop and it would keep repeating itself. So I think it's time that we break free from this. And also in the times that our neighbors are praising our foreign policy, the infamous neighbors. I think India is doing a very great job, and sir, you also have been quite instrumental in making this foreign policy work because of your work, sir. Also, firstly, I would deem it a great honor and privilege to propose a vote of thanks in presence of all the dignitaries present here. Your presence alone has been captivating enough to get us through these 2 days of the conference and the conclave. And I thank all of you for joining us and educating us today. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to everyone who took time and effort to be with us today in this unique learning experience. It gives us immense pleasure to have such sincere participants. I would like to thank all the dignitaries again who spared their time and gave us deep insights on a plethora of topics. I further thank Mr. Julie Ribeiro, sir, Mr. VP Raja, sir, Mr. Nand Kumar Sarvade, sir, Dr. Navshikha Dwara, ma'am, and Professor Kavita Shah, ma'am. I would like to extend my thanks to the trustees of PCGT who gave us this wonderful opportunity to organize this conclave. Apart from Ribeiro, sir, and Raja, sir, I would also like to thank Anna Saldana, ma'am, Rekha Shahani, ma'am, Anand, sir, Gulam, sir, Prasad, sir, Desai, sir, and Abha, ma'am. I would like to further thank the executive board members of the Model United Nations Conference, Mr. Ishan Chitnis, Mr. Drishik Behl, and Leah Montero. I would like to thank our venue partner for the open mic, Bombay Portico, which is based in Thane. And last but not the least, I would like to thank Advocate Shivam Jain Kakadia, who has coordinated this whole event, and my colleagues, Mr. Shlok Mishra, Ms. Rishali Ubale, Ms. Dimple Jangid, Ms. Bianca Chettiar, and all the fellow campus ambassadors like Tanay Musale, Srishti Devkar, Rachana Verma, Gaurav Lokchandani, and everybody who has been quite instrumental in this whole conclave. Last but not the least, I would like to thank each and every participant who contributed to this event and made it a huge success. I thank you all. I hope you have a very great, wonderful evening. Thank you so much. I look forward to see you all at future PCGT events. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanmay. A heartfelt gratitude to all our participants for joining us today and on both days of the conference. Hoping to meet all of you at the webinar and the National Youth Parliament. Thank you, everyone.